Hello, I would like to welcome you to a part video and part online written series of tributes to Ruth Juliana Macrides. And I have insisted on putting Juliana in here because Ruth insisted that that is really what she would have preferred to be called rather than Ruth. So I always feel that we ought to put it up there and give her the name that she loved as opposed to the name that her mother loved instead. So anyway, so it's Ruth Juliana Macrides. And the tributes that we're about to see or read come from her students, who of course all adored her, her colleagues, and from friends in the UK. We've pretty much restricted this to UK colleagues and friends because otherwise we would have had tributes going on for weeks. So this is mostly her UK kind of cohort of people, which goes back a long time. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how I met Ruth. So I'm gonna open with my own tribute to Ruth here. And I met Ruth actually in 1987 at a symposium in Birmingham that I think, if I'm remembering correctly, was organized by Robin Cormack, but it was in Birmingham. It was called the Byzantine Eye. Ruth was at that point almost about to give birth to Anna, her daughter Anna. And I, at that point, met the man I was going to marry a few years later, Chris Wickham. So it was a kind of a momentous meeting from both of our sides, really. And from there, we've known each other ever since, basically. So when Breyer retired in 1993, 1994, it was on the cusp of that he decided to retire because his wife Liz was quite ill at the time and he wanted to be able to devote himself to her care. Ruth and I applied for the job as a job share. And we went and we did our interview and we gave our presentations and we did everything right. And then we went back to our house and we waited and we waited and we waited and we thought, uh-oh, all of this effort, we didn't get the job. And then the phone rang and we had the job. We got the job. Yay! We were very, very happy. And everybody from CBOMGS came over and we had a big party. And as you can see, we got progressively drunker and drunker and had a grand old time. And what the people you see here are obviously me and Ruth, Chris Wickham, Mariana Spinaki here, and this is John Halden in the old days, and this is Liz Breyer's wife, who unfortunately, very sadly, also has since died. So anyway, so we got the job, and that was all grand. So we came to Birmingham in 1994, then September of 1994 for October, and started teaching. And since then, obviously, we had lots of students. We'd shared a lot of teaching. We shared a lot of postgraduate teaching as well, some of whom you see here. I tried to show you, this is the earliest image I have of Ruth with one of our postgraduates, Anna Pianalti, who I think was the first person who came to do a PhD with us in Birmingham after we kind of got there, by this time we were full-time rather than a job share as we came in. And here you see her obviously with Ruth and Jeff at their graduation, and here in Edinburgh in 2018 with bunches of our students. So we went from one student to many in the course of 20 years, whatever, which I suppose is to be expected. Ruth was also, as you will all know, very, very active in the SPBS and ran 2 symposiums before this one, which she unfortunately is not running, but she meant to run and organized. I'm showing you the 2 volumes here in rather fuzzy images, I'm afraid. Travel in the Byzantine World, which was a wonderful symposium on travel, obviously, something Ruth was always very, very interested in, and History as Literature in Byzantium, which is really, let's face it, what she's seriously known for is her ability to look at historical texts as constructs, which has changed the field. Her approach to text has done that. So she was very, very active in the SPBS team, running symposia and running development for years as well. But also, as you all know, in the international scene, Ruth was all over the place. This is a picture which was taken 2 weeks before she died, in fact, at Dunbar Oaks with, there's Niels. You will all recognize Niels. You'll all recognize Alex. Many of these people you probably won't recognize. There's Dimitar Angelov, who used to teach here. And there obviously is Ruth. And one of the reasons I love this picture is because here we all are looking very academic in our suits and ties and our black dresses and our black jackets and our black sweaters. And there's Ruth in white, looking amazing, because Ruth always looked amazing. And she was wonderful at this conference. She was a real kind of, well, she was like a star. She was a star at this conference. She was absolutely great. So I wanted to kind of end by saying that this is the tributes that follow are largely UK based, but obviously also Ruth has a wide international fan club, really, and she probably, well, I know she knew it. She probably didn't think of them as her fan club. I'm sure she didn't. She thought of them as her friends, because that was Ruth's great gift. We were all her friends, and we miss her, and we will miss her. And I'm amazed I got through this without crying. But thanks, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the tributes.
Years ago, during the 18th edition of the CBOMGS Colloquium, I had the privilege to congratulate Professor Leslie Brubaker on the occasion of her retirement. It was my ambition to have a similar chance to congratulate Dr. Ruth Macrides, my main supervisor, whenever she chose to retire. Not only have I lost that opportunity, but my chance to say some words on Ruth's behalf was interrupted due to COVID. Here are the words I wrote for her more than a year ago. For me, Ruth was primarily a mentor and the person who went over hundreds of pages in my poorly written pseudo-academic English, not to mention a myriad of finance forms, activity reports, PhD-derived anxieties, and silly Psellos drawings. She encouraged me to look deeper into the accounts of Michael Psellos, Michael Ataliatis, and John Skilitzis, approaching their historical accounts from a literary point of view instead of using them as mines of historical facts. I fondly remember Ruth's role ahead of the panel entitled How the Byzantines Wrote History in the Belgrade International Conference 2016. As a chair, she had to moderate a panel formed by Warren Treadgold, who argued that Byzantine historians believed in a notion of historical truthfulness that was not very different from our own, Leonora Neville, who approached the topic from the opposite direction, stressing Byzantine practices of history writing that might seem counterintuitive nowadays, and Anthony Kaldelis, who occupied a more pragmatic position, giving more credit to Byzantine historians whose accounts match with data provided by non-Byzantine sources. Ruth was in the middle of all that, as her paper opened the panel and guided later discussion. She began her paper by referring to the history of Byzantine studies, a field in the need of further research. She spoke of the traditional distinction between classicizing histories and monks' chronicles, of our scholarly quest for hard facts, the data we overlooked in the process, of truth and falsehood in Byzantine history, all while citing figures such as Anna Komnini, Nikolaos Mesaritis, and George Akropolitis. Ruth's mediating position in the panel inspired my first steps into the thesis. In the incoming years, I checked many other publications from Ruth, but I particularly remember visiting the Belgrade proceedings, reading the papers by Ruth and the other speakers, and remembering our conversations on the matter following the Congress. Not being able to congratulate Ruth at the end of her career only increases my feeling of unexpected loss. The well-deserved applause came out in the form of many messages that circulated around after her passing, praising Ruth as a scholar, a teacher, and a colleague. The tributes came from lifelong friends, praising all colleagues and her students from the UK and abroad, from Juliana to Washington, Peru, Sydney, and Japan. They praised Ruth's spectacular career as a researcher, her care for her students, and her wonderfully ironic sense of humor. Furthermore, many underlined how Ruth brought life and energy to the CBOMGS community and to the field of Byzantine studies overall. Ruth is greatly missed in Birmingham and wherever her students are researching and promoting the knowledge of the Byzantine past. We will fondly remember her on the occasions we had to enjoy her unforgettable presence and advice.
How wonderful to be here today and talking about Ruth and remembering her. I feel I've known her so long, since she first came to St Andrews, and injected the breath of the Eastern Mediterranean, the breath of a different historical culture, different historical literature, into a academic environment, which was very admirable in all sorts of ways, but kind of locked in a Western European and particularly a British history mentality. She brought with her the excitement and enthusiasm that she had all her life for the Byzantine world. And I always felt that Ruth was somehow the complete Byzantinist. She was, as it were, born and brought up in that environment. It was very much part of her heritage. Her knowledge of the Byzantine Greek was absolutely superb, and her remembrance of the Pontic heritage and so on, that was part of her family background. And she transferred this warmth and enthusiasm to St Andrews and made a huge circle, not a huge circle, but a very good circle of friends within the department, within the university, within the Orthodox community. And she remained in some ways right to the end of her life very much a St Andrews person, very much with her lovely, beautiful house in Queen's Gardens and her wide circle of friends. And she brought to all of this wide circle of friends the warmth, the generosity, the enthusiasm, also the teasing and sort of sense of humour that came along with it. And I long valued and remembered those little meetings that I used to have in the cottage kitchen in St Andrews, just by the old church, and we would sit in the garden. It always seemed to be long summer days when we had these meetings, and put the academic world to rights, talk about people, not always admiring perhaps, but never maliciously, never creating problems that didn't have to be. And then I remember Ruth as a scholar. And Ruth, I think it's fair to say, was always an article person rather than a book person. But what articles there were, and what precision of scholarship there was in her translation work as well. And all of us who knew her remember those times at the Birmingham Symposium and elsewhere, where we would be sitting down in the evenings chatting and no doubt having a glass of wine and so on, and Ruth would be working away, couldn't come down and see us, and we used to think, come on, Ruth, you've done this loads of times before. Why can't you just put it on one side and come down? It'll all be fine. And then the next morning, when we listened to her, we would know why she was making the effort, and we would know that this had been time well spent, for she was pitch perfect. She was a superb miniaturist. Her paper would be beautifully written, make clear points, elegantly presented, a joy to listen to. And it's that sort of quality that we shall all miss so much in the years to come. A great friend, a wonderful scholar. May she rest in peace. May God have mercy on her soul.
I am delighted to join you all in recognizing, thanking, and missing my PhD advisor, Byzantine Studies Guide, and the social glue that held together the Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies, Dr. Ruth Macrides. I don't need to tell you about her work. You already know it. It stands on its own and it speaks for itself. I'll just say I am continually revisiting Yorios Akropolitis and Nomos and Canon on paper and in court quite often. Ruth steadfastly prodded many of us towards better writing in English and better reading in Greek, as she was continually patient through countless drafts of many articles with, as she put it, Teutonic footnotes. And on top of that, she sent rivers of references to boot. Ruth could also grease the gears of historical production. She made connections that allowed for many students to attend the International Byzantine Greek Summer School for years, as well as publications in the University of Birmingham's Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies journal. And on top of that, she provided links, for example, with Edinburgh University Press through her committee membership there and professional connections. Ruth was intimate with the delicate process by which history is produced. When she sadly passed away in 2019, CBOMGS was devastated. We, and myself personally, will always feel her loss. She was, of course, more than a professional and scholarly mentor. We all know she kept as many secrets as she divulged. A person as familiar with so many people as she could equally be full of mystique. Nevertheless, Ruth has been almost like family to me, as she has for many, many other people. I happily carry her memories and lessons with me every day, and hopefully will continue to for many years to come. Ruth, Evcharisto Poliya Ola.
Hello, my name's Frances Andrews. I'm one of Ruth's colleagues at the University of St Andrews. It's a delight, but also a sadness to be participating in the symposium this year. A delight because it was the symposium that Ruth was organising and was so pleased to be asked to organise. Sadness, of course, because she's not here to enjoy it. But I want to talk a little bit more about my memories of Ruth going back to the mid-90s when I first met her, and how she shaped my career. We first met laughing hysterically over a radiator at a departmental party when there was too much drinking going on, and she kept telling me, no, it's not normally like this. She was right, of course. And then she, with enormous generosity, agreed to give me and two other colleagues, volunteered to give me and two other colleagues, tutorials on 11th century Byzantine history, which none of us, outrageously, had encountered before. And I remember those tutorials with admiration. There was lots of laughter, expertise. She wanted it to get done properly, and she was an enormous enabler of our ability to go on and teach. And from those couple of encounters, I took away her enthusiasm for teaching, her ability to combine expertise with humour, something I've always tried to emulate, not with necessarily great success, and her ability to treat everybody as her peers, even very newly fledged colleagues, and of course her many doctoral students and other colleagues. That generosity of spirit was characteristic of her. More recent memories are linked to sitting around the kitchen table in her lovely house in Queen's Gardens in St Andrews, or in our cottage in King's Barnes, putting the world to rights, lots of laughter, lots of detail and fun, and two people often came up in those conversations, both long dead. The Marquis of Bute and, of course, George Acropolites. She would frequently take public transport to get herself over to the archive on Bute to pursue the Byzantine interests of the Marquis. But much more prominent, of course, was, at least in the years I knew her, her work on George. Acropolites came up so often in conversation, and listening to her as she worked out the details of the commentary, focused on the language. It was no surprise when the resulting edition was welcomed with acclaim. Brilliant translation, her ability to switch between English and the Greek of the original and produce a really elegant translation is admirable. And her concern to get all of the contextual detail in her commentary right, really, it took her years, but it shows in the result. And the last thing I want to say about Ruth, I suppose, is just that, as I think everybody knows, she was a last-minuter. She never believed in herself, so she always left it to the last moment. She did everything with painstaking care, which meant that she was very often, when you met her, about to give a paper, but had been working on it and hadn't yet got it finished and was convinced she hadn't got anything new to say. And you were always reassuring her. And of course, she was always producing something brilliant and entertainingly and carefully constructed. So Ruth is much missed for her wit, for her charm, for her capacity to listen and to want to be around people, for her beauty and her love of beauty. She gave a lot in her life to other people, and she will be much missed both in medieval studies and, of course, in Byzantine studies and in all our hearts.
I met Dr. Ruth Macrides in 2017. From the very first moment we met, she was very kind and very good to me. She helped me with my modules, and she also explained to me how things work in this country and this university. I'm very grateful that I had the honor to be one of her students. She pushed me to be better, and she gave me advice and guidance. Ruth Macrides was a true inspiration for all of us, with her kindness and ethos. And this is how I will remember her, not only as the great scholar she was, but also as a good and kind person who would always try to do the right thing. Thank you for everything, Ruth. Rest in peace.
Although I first met Ruth in 1998 at an Oxford seminar, it was only when I moved to St Andrews in 2006 that we started to get to know one another. St Andrews is a small town after all, and everywhere is within 10 minutes walk of Queen's Gardens, so it was only natural that we began to meet. Ruth was usually striding with bag and purpose to the university library, and our snatched conversations soon developed into longer talks over tea, about research, yes, but many other subjects besides, including the Sicilian detective Il Commissario Montalbano. I was struck immediately by Ruth's style, sweeping across the streets of St Andrews, and her seriousness as a scholar. She impressed on me very early on that maintaining the Byzantine collection in the library was my responsibility, and for several years used to email me all the titles she'd recommended for purchase in Birmingham. Did anyone else receive this stream of suggestions, I wonder? Ruth was certainly instrumental in getting me involved in SPBS in 2008. She recognised the invaluable role the Society plays in connecting us all together, even or perhaps especially those of us north of the Wall, where Procopius famously tells us it is actually impossible for a person to survive even half an hour, but countless snakes and serpents and every other kind of wild creature occupy this area as their own. But it was when I was serving as an external examiner for 4 years from 2013 in Birmingham that we really got to know one another well, as we both grappled with the latest university system. Ruth taught both undergraduates and graduates every year, and this leads me to a final reflection: her standards. Year after year, I read her precise comments and her marks, and year after year, I observed that her marks were at the lower end of the range of possibilities. This separated her from everyone else. External examiners sometimes discover grade inflation, but rarely, if ever, grade deflation. Ruth's standards were incredibly high, and she expected the same from her students. That she so often extracted the highest quality from her students is testament to her skills as a teacher, even if she rarely went above 72. So Ruth's style, her scholarly seriousness, and her standards, these three facets I shall always remember.
I first met Ruth when she became my module tutor in my undergraduate here at Birmingham. It turned out she was also my personal tutor. I think the first time that I ever actually encountered her in person, she was teaching a lesson and had managed to get confused because the PowerPoint wasn't complying. And at first we just thought it was a bit of a technical glitch. Only when I walked over to see her at the podium did I realise that she was holding the mouse the wrong way round. this is the kind of sort of thing that Ruth kind of became known for. Technology was not her best friend, and it made for some of the funniest moments with her as well. We got quite close during my undergraduate, and she particularly got close to that group. We were very engaged and very interested in learning about the city of Constantinople. So much so, in fact, that I actually went on to study Greek at night school in first year, and as soon as Ruth heard about this, she not only forwarded me to the Greek Byzantine summer school, but through one of her funds that she set up for a previous student, she actually paid for me to go. I think for me, that was the moment at which my desire to go on and do PhD and seriously consider scholarship as an avenue was kind of birthed. And I think without her influence, I wouldn't really be here now. So it's very strange to think of her as no longer around, and it's still kind of hard. Back then we were celebrating the release of a new book of hers, and we took her out to Marco Pierre White's restaurant in the middle of Birmingham. And this kind of set the tone for all of my other encounters with Ruth after that, including the second to last time that I saw her, when we discussed the advice that she'd been given by her masseuse. We had dinner over it. Yeah, fantastic tutor. Someone who's inspired the person that I am today. And I miss her a lot. A lot.
Hi, I'm Manthazar Makupi, and I'm here with Irini, my daughter, and I would like to share a few thoughts to Juliani, Ruth Macrides. During this extraordinary year, I have often thought of you, dearest Juliani. I have thought of you as a supporting colleague and the kind of conversations that we would have had in light of the difficulties of carrying on our jobs. And I have thought of you as a friend whose insightful and witty comments would have carried me with a smile through the day. Thank you.
Hello, greetings everyone from Belgrade. I would like to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to pay my respect to the late Professor Ruth Macrides. I first met Professor Macrides in 2011 in Belgrade when she came to give a lecture, The Late Byzantine Palace and its Ceremonial, as a guest of the Institute for Byzantine Studies. I had just started to work there, and for me, as a very young scholar, it was quite an event to take part in such a pleasant and informal conversation with her. At that time, she was just a distinguished name from numerous publications I consulted for my work, and I remember thinking that I was very lucky to finally be able to meet her in person. In 2015, I applied for the doctoral scholarship of the SASA Young Leaders Fellowship Fund of the Tokyo Foundation, and I was supposed to choose a professor who I would consult for my research and an institution I would be based in for a period of 1 month. As my research topic was closely connected to the work of Professor Macrides on the late Byzantine historiography, it was only natural for me to choose her as my supervisor. Luckily, she accepted and wrote an invitation letter for me, so I was able to get the scholarship and come to Birmingham in March 2015. The memories I have from Birmingham are more than beautiful, and I will forever treasure all the lengthy conversations I had with Professor Macrides every week. I will forever be grateful for the chance to take part in her classes, to participate in very fruitful discussions with her students and, of course, with her. I will never forget the admiration we all shared for her. I will never forget the energy with which she held her classes, the passion she had for Byzantine studies and for the topics that interested her. And I will forever remember the warm welcome with which I was greeted when I came to Birmingham. When I got back to Belgrade, we naturally stayed in touch, and I also will be grateful to her for having always responded to my emails despite her many preoccupations. She never forgot to ask how I was doing, not just professionally, but also personally. I will also be grateful to her for having accepted to chair one of the thematic sessions at the 23rd Congress of Byzantine Studies, which dealt with the late Byzantine historiography, and for the chance I got to introduce my parents to her. Professor Ruth Macrides and I were making plans for me to come again to Birmingham to work on my book related to Nikiforos Grigoras and his Roman history. But unfortunately, life had other plans and unexpected and sad things occurred. Nevertheless, I will always be grateful for the chance I got to meet her, to take part in her classes, to be able to feel that wonderful atmosphere at the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham, and for having had the chance to be her student even for just a short period of time. Thank you, everybody. I wish you all a very pleasant and successful conference, and goodbye.
I think every student that's passed through Birmingham University or just developed an interest in Byzantine studies has been touched by Ruth in some way. I'm very much a product of Birmingham system, and Ruth had always been there. Sometimes encouraging, sometimes gently shunting you in a different direction to where you were going, but she was ever present. She was most people's introduction to the centre, greeting year group after year group after year group, whether pointing students in the direction of appropriate training courses or lending out her books with this meticulous record keeping of who had what and when they'd taken it out and when she wanted it back. She had a particular efficiency with everything that I will never understand how she maintained. She ensured that everybody attended the CBOMGS lectures, and she always made sure that the after-lecture dinner was a friendly and inviting place for everybody of any stage of their career. She kept the Whitting Room Library going, despite pushback from certain quarters, through her sheer determination, and through a string of loyal and devoted librarians, and their devotion was as much to Ruth herself as it was to the library. Even at large academic conferences, which Ruth always used to protest to us that she hated, she was always there for attending students, checking up on how things were going. One of the reasons that Ruth has always been held in such distinct affection is that she was never too busy to give advice, to hear a problem and to offer help. If Briar was the root of the Centre of Byzantine Studies at Birmingham and Leslie its head, then Ruth was very much the heart and the life force of the centre. And while this tribute comes from me personally, I know that this also speaks to many individual experiences of Ruth over many, many years.
Hello everyone, I'm Rosemary Morris, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to say a few words on Ruth's contribution to the study of Byzantine law. No one who has read the commentaries of the 12th century canonists, began one of Ruth's papers in 1991. The problem was then that few outside a circle of specialist Byzantinists actually had. It's still true, as James Morton has recently pointed out, that canon law is a niche within the niche study of Byzantine law. But the fact that in the last 5 years we've seen 4 monographs, on aspects of Byzantine law in English alone surely indicates a flourishing interest in the subject. All of them cite and make use of the work of Ruth Macrides. Why? I've only time to touch upon three aspects of Ruth's contribution to the study of Byzantine law, which make her work indispensable reading. The themes of her work, her mastery of sources, and her enthusiastically comparative approach. Her stay in the Max Planck Institute for the History of European Law in Frankfurt in 1980 to 1981 was clearly a crucial moment in the development of her academic interests. For don't forget that her doctoral work was on the historian George Akrapolites. Many of her early studies reflect the socio-legal bent of the Frankfurt Byzantinists. They're concerned with the circumstances in which individuals came into contact with the law or with lawyers, in cases ranging from murder to marriage, dowry and inheritance, how they viewed the law and how it treated them. For real human beings and their experiences were never far away from Ruth's concerns. But what in fact was the law, and where could it be found? Ruth approached these thorny questions from a number of different angles. She discussed the nature of Byzantine civil and ecclesiastical law, nomos and canon, in a paper she gave to our Spring Symposium in 1986. In a paper on killing, asylum and the law, 1988, she demonstrated how imperial legislation came to be interpreted by clerical courts, so that the letter of the law was moderated by consideration of the context in which the alleged crime was committed, an expression of that oikonomia so characteristic of the Byzantine Church and so difficult to translate. Nomos and canon were in fact interrelated and intertwined, and the law was not just the law in the law books. It could be found or deduced from court cases, from literary texts, from history, from hagiography. And that brings me to my second point, Ruth's mastery of an immense range of sources. Not only was she familiar with the normative texts of Byzantine law, the enormous collection of the Basilika, the imperial legislation, the canon law collections, particularly those of Zonaras and Balsamon, but also the cases heard by Chromatianos and Apokakos in the later period, and those collected in the mysterious Pyra of the 11th century. And anyone who has tried to read and understand that particular text will know how very challenging it is. But this was not all. In one of the last papers she wrote on matters legal, The Law Outside the Law Books, published in 2005, before she turned her attention to Byzantine ceremonial and I think finally saw off toward Akrapolites, Ruth ranged from the Pyra to her old friends Chromatianos and Apokakos, via the Timorial, the Bagoas prosecution speech by Nikiforos Vasilakis, and a poem by an ecclesiastical judge, Andronicus. Again, the range of sources is remarkable, as was her willingness to revisit familiar texts and view them in a new light. Which brings me to my third and last point. The article I've just mentioned was prompted by Ruth's interest in the so-called law and literature movement in America, which studies law as literature as well as law in literature. What was the place, for example, of rhetorical and narrative strategies in Byzantine law? And how did Byzantine lawmakers, law practitioners, and law users employ them? Big questions which more recent studies have certainly taken up. Ruth was always open to new ideas. And literature from beyond what we might, not altogether jokingly, call the Byzantine ghetto. Peter Koss and Paul Brand, historians of medieval English law, were just as likely to be cited as Troyanos, Vauban or Siren. She continually provided an accessible but always critical entree into continental and American legal scholarship. If you've not yet dipped into her collected studies, Kinship and Justice in Byzantium, please do. If you only read one work, search out The Law Outside the Law Books, Law and Literature, Fontes Minores 11, 2005. And if you cannot find a copy of that, contact me and I'll send you one.
Ruth was a person of great loyalty to her students, to national Byzantine institutions, to her mentors, and to her scholarly homes. Frances Andrews spoke movingly at the funeral about her love of St Andrews, and so many students have made it clear how she felt about Birmingham. She loved Dumbarton Oaks, the old house, the garden, the ginkgos along R Street, and she was happy to return 3 times a year as senior fellow. What's not so well known are Ruth's Belfast years, between 1983 and 1986, when she flew in every other week to teach and then returned a week later to St Andrews. Every time she arrived, it was like Christmas. She brought news, off-prints, delights from her kitchen, accounts of seminars, a sense of a world outside. She lived here, in this room, and sat downstairs in the kitchen after supper, telling stories and laughing, as we did so many times afterwards. Belfast in those days was still in throes of the Troubles, and she was to teach in a room which overlooked University Square, where a colleague was shot dead in December 1983. Queen's had Byzantine studies students, but a shortage of teachers after the retirement of the professor. I obtained a small teaching assistance fund and went for the best. St Andrews at that time offered her some first arts teaching in the Department of Medieval History, where Paul taught. I think the attraction of Belfast for her was not just the Biz students, but also the opportunity to teach things other than history. Above all, Greek texts. She chose Macrides' Epitaphius for his brother John one term, a taxing decision, but she carried it off. We're now so impressed by her mastery of the combination of law and social history, and later of court cultures and ceremony, that we forget her brilliant work on literature, on ekphrasis, historiography, and at the end her return to Macrides. At that time Ruth and Paul were not long back from Frankfurt, and she was working on the early legal pieces. I was writing up Friendship from the Life and Death Symposium, and she was working up the Byzantine Godfather from Aristocracy, so we had a lot of conversation in which she was characteristically acute and rigorous, particularly about the handling of anthropology. The one piece which really made an enormous impact in Belfast was the Cannibal poem. We heard all about it, the field trip to Venice, staying in the Greek Institute and walking to the Bojana. We pored over the microfilm, and she revealed the poem to an evening seminar which had ancient historians and classicists hooked. That was hard to do, not least in arguing out the translation. Byzantine graduate students suddenly realised that this was what doing research was. And what I now know is just how good and original that work was, decades ahead of current interest in lament and hybrid experiment. We talked a lot in those days about teaching. It was before the Colloquium and the Friday Text Seminar, before the publication series and the projects. We were still building the BA degree, and we had the first few graduate students. Ruth spent a lot of time with them, with wine glass in hand. To talk to her was an education, says one. And they reciprocated, taking her sightseeing in heels and fur coat, putting her into taxis when the time came to head for the other island. The driver bellowing down the street, "Taxi for Macrides! Taxi for Macrides!" buying her a glass skirt for when she and Paul headed off via Fiji for a fellowship at the Humanities Research Centre of the Australian National University at Canberra. We always picked her up from the airport. On one occasion the flight was diverted from Aldergrove to the then new city airport, and we arrived in haste, anxious that she might be worried. We found her, sitting calmly, with enormous concentration, making notes on a photocopy, finishing the lecture for the next day. How often in the future would we see this at conferences, when she finished papers minutes before her slot, perfectly timed and written by hand? Our last sighting of her as a Belfast scholar was at Rosemary's Church and People Symposium, when the students we took were thrilled because chair after chair introduced speakers, including Ruth, as members of the Belfast Mafia. I asked her for the next year, of course, but she simply said her husband had things for her to do. We both turned out to be pregnant and shared our antenatal experiences hilariously by phone, I suppose, since it was before email. She and I and Mary Beard all arrived, enormous, each in the last trimester, for Robin's Byzantine Eye Symposium, at which she did finally sit down to deliver her part of The Architecture of Ekphrasis, a week before she delivered Anna. It wasn't to be the last of Belfast. She was a scrupulous external examiner, for example, and the friendships deepened over the years, but it was the end of the closeness of those 3 years, in which she came to family christenings and weekends in Dublin and faculty seminars, and we could see so clearly every day her brilliance and passion and learning and commitment and rigour and range and sheer originality. It had been an every other weekly privilege.
I cannot believe I'm offering this tribute to Ruth when I haven't had my hair cut for 12 months. I got used over the years to always feeling scruffy and underdressed in Ruth's presence. But this is ridiculous. The aspect of Ruth's work I want to talk about is her enthusiasm for spreading the word about Byzantium among a wider public. I discovered this for myself in 2008 when the Royal Academy put on its Byzantium exhibition, the first to be held in the UK for 50 years. It was curated by Robin Cormack and Maria Vasilaki, following in the footsteps of David Talbot Rice, curator of the 1958 exhibition. That had been shown both in London and in Edinburgh, a connection which we thought would make our exhibition particularly relevant to a Scottish audience. I had a talk on the topic ready to go, and Ruth, I discovered from her years in St Andrews, had a network of potential venues ready to be activated. So with the backing of the SPBS Development Committee, on which Ruth was serving at the time, I was duly dispatched to the Scottish Hellenic Society and similar venues, very conscious that I was following a trail which he had blazed, addressing audiences which he had developed. So for me, it's very appropriate that one of the ways that we can still hear Ruth's voice today is in the recording of the lecture that she gave at the British School at Athens in May 2018 on the Scottish connection to Byzantine and modern Greek studies. Her protagonist, the third Marquis of Bute, has come in for a lot of attention recently as a TV programme currently available on iPlayer, but this is mainly as an enthusiast for Victorian Gothic architecture. It was Ruth who pointed out his early interests in Greece and Turkey and his pioneering work in the late 19th century Byzantine revival. She describes the church he commissioned at Galston, southwest Glasgow, as the closest in spirit to Justinian's church of all the St. Sophias in Britain and indeed in the world. So this is one trip I'm promising myself after lockdown, a pilgrimage to Galston and to the other Bute sites in Scotland, Falkland Palace, Dumfries House, and his ancestral home, Mount Stewart, on the island of Bute. I just wish that Ruth could be there with me.
I knew of Ruth before ever meeting her. Her 1988 BOMGS piece on Paul the Silentiary and ekphrasis with Paul was and remains incredibly influential for me. It's a springboard, diving into so many ways of thinking about ekphrasis and art and text. And I knew of her as someone writing important things on Byzantine families and women, and on law and kinship. Then I started to meet her at conferences. We examined theses together. We corresponded occasionally. We worked on the SPBS committee together. We were, I felt, colleagues. And I was proud to think that I could be a colleague of Ruth. It wasn't until the Dumbarton Oaks Holy Apostles Symposium of 2015 that I felt I was starting to know her as a friend. She and I were staying in the Dumbarton Oaks guest house, which promised breakfast, but delivered old cornflakes, white bread and margarine. Sorry if that sounds ungrateful. Anyway, Ruth joined me in finding better ways to breakfast in Dumbarton Oaks. I remember then noticing her shoes and, as a flat-soles keep-it-simple person, being full of admiration for the way in which she could move in the most ridiculous of footwear. I remember one evening as well, when she and I and Margaret Mullet, met after all the business and fuss of the symposium was over, and we drank wine in the sun down near the library, and we gossiped as Byzantinists, as colleagues, as friends. More recently, Ruth and I were discussing trying to put together a project about 19th century Byzantium in Britain. She was working again on the third Marquis of Bute, and we had a lovely couple of days at the British School in Athens planning, before coming home to wrestle with the research officers of our respective universities and bemoaning these complexities via email. I was so looking forward to working with Ruth. Like all of us, I miss her.
My doctoral journey in Birmingham took a little longer than that of most other students. But that means I had the pleasure of having Ruth as my supervisor for all those years. We grew close, and she became more than a supervisor to me. She was someone who was a guiding light to me, and she always encouraged me to carry on, to plow on, to succeed. And I've never met anyone who is so genuinely excited about their students' achievements as she was, no matter how big or small. Every student was special to her, and we felt like an extended family. We still do, connected across time and space. I first met Ruth in the spring of 2011 when I attended the Birmingham Byzantine seminar and considered doing a PhD, so we had a bit of a chat. And I was very excited to receive an email from Briar a couple of months after that, where he was telling me that she was going to become my supervisor on my doctoral journey on Trebizond, and that I would be thrilled to know that her roots were in the Pontus as well. Sure enough, a few years later, Ruth shared this newspaper article, I think it was from the New York Times, where which told the story of her grandparents. I was asked to take a piece of Ruth's writing and comment on how it has influenced mine. That's not an easy task. It could have been any of her writings, as they have all been essential for my doctoral thesis. So, which one should I pick? Should I take Pseudokodinos, both in terms of her article, which influenced my thinking during my master's, or perhaps the volume with Angelov and Munitis, and all the subsequent discussions on how court titles were used in Trebizond? Should I focus on New Constantines and New Constantinople, and this whole illusion of continuity through the Nicene hiatus that has thoroughly shaped our understanding of the late period? Or perhaps I should pick her excellent and perceptive article on dynastic marriages and political kinship that fed my interest to study the implications of marriage alliances. With apologies to Ruth, I picked the article called What's in a Name, which is on the use of megas in Trebizond, simply as I think it is my statutory duty. I must apologize, as she was not particularly fond of this article, brushing it off as just something that she wrote ages ago as a junior scholar. And yet today, it still remains an oft-cited and authoritative writing that so clearly set out the sources and discussions on the use of the term megas in Trebizond, and it does so in an insightful and persuasive way. No wonder why, after reading that article, the first step I embarked on my doctoral journey was to study the use of megas in Trebizond. Not that I had that much to add to her article, but it just felt as the necessary threshold exercise for any scholar seeking to claim expertise on Trebizond. Not that Ruth would have described herself as one. She always emphasized how little she knew about Trebizond, but that was simply not true. This was just being her humble self. She had a really profuse knowledge of all the sources on Trebizond and really insightful comments and observations. And we discussed Greek so often, my translations of Panaretos and Livadinos. Her intellect and enthusiasm, paired with her dedication, were quite a powerful combination. But what made her Ruth was the unique aspect of finding something fun and enjoyable in everything that she embarked on. I never got to tell her just how much I appreciated her and how grateful I am for everything that she gave me during all those years and after. But perhaps in front of this audience I can just say how thankful I am to have had Ruth as my supervisor. So, thank you.